When a movie studio has a hit on their hands, one of the first things they do is ask, how can we make more of these? How can we turn this into a sequel? And sometimes they knock it out of the park with movies like The Godfather Part 2, Toy Story 3, and Top Gun Maverick. This video is not about those movies. No, in this video, I want to explore these sequels that pretty much ended the franchise they were supposed to continue. Some of these are bad, some of them are disappointing, but all of them were a real step down and are some of the worst sequels ever made, if not some of the worst movies ever made. Paul W.S. Anderson's original Mortal Kombat film in 1995 was by no means a critical darling. Based on the video game series that recommended talking as opposed to fighting as a way to settle disputes between two parties, Mortal Kombat was a massive commercial hit, raking in $122 million on a $20 million budget. Sure, the visuals were a bit cheesy and the dialogue hammy, but it was a fun movie. The worst thing is that it had a PG-13 rating, so they had to hold back quite a bit. But then, 2 years later came Mortal Kombat Annihilation. It was directed by John R. Leonetti, who was the cinematographer on the first film. Now, when you have a sequel to a successful movie, there's a well-trodden path. You bring in more characters, maybe more action, and you go deeper into the mythos if it's an adaptation. You also bring back the cast. Instead, Annihilation lost all but two of the original cast. Only Robin Shou and Talisa Soto, who played Liu Kang and Katana respectively, returned for the $30 million film. Despite having a bigger budget, it somehow ended up looking worse than the previous movie. You get some serious straight-to-DVD kind of vibes from it, though even those usually end up looking better. Now, how you perceive the movie might impact your enjoyment of it. Jason Gibner of AllMovie wrote, quote, "Whereas the first film was a guilty schlock pleasure, this sequel is an exercise in the art of genuinely beautiful trash cinema," end quote. Now, I think trash and slop are some of the most overused and needlessly applied words when critiquing a film. That being said, if you think about it, as R.L. Schaefer of IGN wrote, quote, "A spoof of the early video game movies and their painfully obvious cash-in mentality," end quote, your estimation of it might increase. Unfortunately though, if you want to take it as a non-satirical movie, it's just bad. In a movie like that, over-the-top acting, terrible dialogue, and exposition dumps can sort of be dismissed. No one plays or watches Mortal Kombat for that, at least I don't think so. It's about the fights, but the fights in Annihilation are perhaps even worse. Good editing and choreography are the bread and butter of fight scenes. The fight scenes in here feel floaty and have no impact, with weird speed-ups, changed positions, mistimed cuts, and for some reason, not a speck of dirt on our intrepid heroes. The movie was eviscerated, critically and commercially. It made $51 million on its $30 million budget, and got terrible critical and audience reviews. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus is pretty harsh, quote, "With its shallow characters, low-budget special effects, and mindless fight scenes, Mortal Kombat Annihilation offers minimal plot development and manages to underachieve the low bar set by its predecessor," unquote. Producer Lawrence Kasanoff said, quote, "Our theme for the sequel is to shoot for more. More fights, more special effects, more outworld, more everything," end quote. Well, sometimes less is more. In trying to appease fans, they made a movie that iced the franchise for decades. It wouldn't be rebooted until 2021. 1994 was a legendary year for Jim Carrey. He had three of his most successful films that year: Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, Dumb and Dumber, and The Mask, each making more than $100 million, $200 million, and $300 million at the box office respectively. The Mask in particular made $351 million at the box office on a tiny $18 million budget, a surprise blockbuster. It was based on the Mask comics by John Arcudi and Doug Mahnke. In it, Carrey's character finds a mask that, when he puts it on, turns him into Jim Carrey but with a green face. The movie was more cartoon-like than many movies, and Carrey was a perfect fit. Not only did audiences enjoy it, but so did critics. It was also Cameron Diaz's first film and immediately shot her to fame. 2005's Son of the Mask, on the other hand, might have been one of the worst fumbles in cinematic history. Right off the bat, Jim Carrey did not return after not enjoying doing the Ace Ventura sequel. Instead, they brought on Jamie Kennedy, whose character discovers the mask and then has a kid that inherits the mask's powers, all while trying to be stopped by Loki, who created the mask. Alas, Jamie Kennedy, though a prolific actor unto his own, was no Jim Carrey, and he could not carry the movie. The 11-year gap was a huge issue as well. Legacy sequels were a bit more uncommon then than they are now, but they still happen. But one core component of making legacy sequels is some link to the past, often through the main character. Fondness was attached to Carrey, not necessarily The Mask as a movie unto itself. Losing him lost the soul of the movie, which most saw as a cash grab. But there was no cash to grab. Made on a budget of as high as $100 million, the movie made less than $60 million at the box office, an unqualified box office disaster. Beyond that, it's considered to be one of the worst films of all time. Richard Roeper, while co-hosting Ebert and Roeper, said, quote, In the 5 years I've been co-hosting this show, this is the closest I've ever come to walking out halfway through the film, and now that I look at the experience, I wish I had, end quote. Scott Tobias at the AV Club wrote, rather amusingly I thought, quote, "No doubt extensive market research shows that there's an audience out there for movies like Son of the Mask, but it's too depressing to speculate who that might be," end quote. The movie was loud, garish, and grating. Both tried to turn cartoons into live action, which is certainly doable, but a comedy movie succeeds or fails by how well the lead can carry it. Carey could, Kennedy could not. All that being said, a third Mask movie is in development, with Carey and Cameron Diaz both expressing an interest in returning. We'll see where that goes. Steven Spielberg's Jaws in 1975 was a watershed moment in film history. The movie basically invented the summer blockbuster, changed how movies were distributed, was the highest-grossing movie until Star Wars came out a couple of years later, and kickstarted a franchise as well as a cadre of imitators that draw inspiration from it to this day. The success of the first one led to Jaws 2 and Jaws 3D, both of which suffered a steep critical and commercial decline, though both were able to make multiples of their budget. But then came Jaws: The Revenge, the fourth film in the franchise, and certainly the most infamous. This is the one that Michael Caine has a famous quip about, quote, "I have never seen it, but by all accounts it is terrible. However, I have seen the house that it built, and it is terrific," end quote. Good for him. The movie came out in 1987, 4 years after Jaws 3D, and 12 years after Spielberg's masterwork. It also had no continuity from the third one, and some of Universal's press material at the time basically called it a sequel to Jaws 2. Directed by Joseph Sargent, it brought back Lorraine Gary, who had played Ellen Brody, Roy Scheider's wife, in the first one. She's widowed, has a son killed by the shark, and thinks that the shark is out to get revenge on her and her family, hunting them across thousands of miles. Gary was also married to Sid Sheinberg, CEO of MCA Universal at the time. Similar to the first Jaws, the film experienced delays and issues with the mechanical sharks that they used, which led to shooting going on for longer and the film going past its original $23 million budget. But they also had a release date that they needed to hit, so they just kept hurrying along. In fact, the production was so mismanaged that Michael Caine, who had won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for Hannah and Her Sisters, actually had to miss the ceremony because he was stuck making the movie. To be fair to Joseph Sargent and the crew though, this movie had no chance. It was fast-tracked for release by the studio in September of 1986, for release in June of 1987, a scant 9 months for pre-production, production, and post-production. The movie is full of continuity errors and amounts to an incoherent mess, all of which can be ascribed to it being a rushed product. Critically, the film was annihilated. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 2% from critics and a 15% from audiences, which somehow kind of feels worse than a 0%. The consensus reads, quote, "Illogical, tension-free, and filled with cut-rate special effects, Jaws: The Revenge is a sorry chapter in a once proud franchise," end quote. Roger Ebert was harsh, writing, quote, "Jaws: The Revenge is not simply a bad movie, but also a stupid and incompetent one, a ripoff," end quote. The film barely scraped by with a profit, but it was the nail in the coffin for the franchise and a steep decline from its industry-changing heyday. Not only is it one of the worst sequels ever made, it is, by far, one of the worst movies ever made. At best, it failed to live up to its legacy and, at worst, undermined it with a cheap and rushed production. Oddly enough, there's another sequel to a beloved Jim Carrey movie that doesn't feature Jim Carrey that also flopped and is also a pretty bad sequel. 2003's Bruce Almighty starring Carrey was a massive hit, pulling $484 million on an $81 million budget. Did it get great reviews? No, not particularly. But Carrey was hilarious as he tried to play God for a week. Audiences also loved it. This was Carrey in his prime, with Morgan Freeman becoming the voice of God to a generation. The sequel, 2007's Evan Almighty, took a different turn. First, they again replaced Jim Carrey, this time with Steve Carell, who was in the first movie. Carell is a great actor and a funny guy on his own, so it wasn't necessarily a bad choice or an unreasonable one. But Steve Carell wasn't the real star of the show. No, that would be the special and practical effects which helped push its budget to an eye-watering $175 million, still the most expensive comedy movie ever made. Hell, they even built a real ark that was 450 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 51 feet tall. Alas, this is kind of like having somebody that's not James Cameron try to direct a James Cameron kind of movie. It's a modern-day retelling of Noah's Ark, and Carell's character needs to reenact it. He's chosen by God to build an ark in his neighborhood, complete with the animals marching on 2 by 2. But as Son of the Mask proved, movies that were originally built around Jim Carrey tend not to do very well when Jim Carrey isn't part of them. Richard Roeper even praised Carrey for passing on the project, noting that his decision to forego Son of the Mask, Evan Almighty, and the sequel to Dumb and Dumber called Dumb and Dumberer, When Harry Met Lloyd, was a good move. calling them 3 of the worst sequels of all time. And just to note, I suppose I could have substituted Dumb and Dumberer here, but I digress. Evan Almighty was a disaster, making less than $175 million at the box office and becoming one of the biggest bombs of all time. Critics like Peter Travers of Rolling Stone wrote that it was, quote, shamelessly juvenile, pseudo-religious, mock-sincere, end quote. This was one of the main criticisms of the film. ILM did solid work with the special effects, but everything else fell flat. It wasn't as funny as the first one, and didn't seem to know what it wanted to be. Similar to Son of the Mask, the studio wanted a more family-friendly film, but it ended up rebounding on them. It even destroyed the career of its director, Tom Shadyac, who's directed just one more feature in the intervening years, 2018's Brian Banks. The inclusion of 2016's Independence Day Resurgence, directed by Roland Emmerich, wounds me on a personal level. The first Independence Day, also directed by Emmerich and starring Will Smith in his prime, Jeff Goldblum, and Bill Pullman, is one of my favorite movies ever made. I've seen the movie dozens of times over the years, and it is, I think, the ultimate 90s blockbuster. It's a movie that wears its heart as well as its cheesiness on its sleeve. The destruction of the White House is one of the most iconic disaster scenes, and the movie has some of the best one-liners as well as the greatest speech in cinematic history delivered by Bill Pullman. And for me, it also raises serious questions about what lengths would we go to repel a full-scale invasion of the country. That is there a future in which a nuclear bomb is detonated by Americans over American soil in a non-testing capacity? The star power, the wonderful effects, the destruction of cities, the one-liners, the ridiculousness of an advanced alien species being brought low by an Apple PowerBook 5300, it all came together to deliver a masterpiece of 90s cinema that pulled more than $800 million on a $75 million budget. To top it all off, it's an original film. Sure, it has influences, but it's not based on or adapted from anything. Critics might not have enjoyed it, but audiences certainly loved it. Both were on the same page when decrying the 2016 sequel though. Rumors of the sequel had swirled around years as Hollywood's reliance on legacy sequels kept increasing. But when it finally did arrive, it was not but a mangled mess of what could have been. Glaringly, Will Smith did not return, opting to go to DC instead. This was a big point of contention, and even Emmerich agreed, saying, quote, I should have stopped making the movie because we had a much better script, then I had to really fast cobble another script together, end quote. He added that, quote, I should have just said no because all of a sudden I was making something I criticized myself for, a sequel, end quote. More than that though, the original is carried in large part by the charm of the lead cast. While the sequel might have individually decent actors like Liam Hemsworth, Micah Monroe, and Jesse Usher playing Smith's stepson, joined by Jeff Goldblum and Bill Pullman, the original was not greater than the sum of its parts. It was visually impressive, as most of Emmerich's films tend to be. It was light on story and on character, as many of his films tend to be as well. But worst of all, it was boring, which is definitely not how most of his films are. The guy makes fun, epic films that reward a watch in theaters. Resurgence just isn't it though. Of it, Dave Palmer wrote, rather amusingly, quote, the final shot of the film is a setup for another sequel, and I just pray to God aliens come and wipe us out before that day comes, end quote. The original was simple, which is part of the reason it worked so well. People did not warm to this one though. It made $389.5 million on its $165 million budget, half the gross of the original, made worse when you account for inflation. Plans for a third, which would have included intergalactic travel, were shelved. If putting Roland Emmerich's Independence Day Resurgence on here hurt, putting Michael Bay's Transformers The Last Night hurts even more. I like the Transformers movies a lot more than most, and saw them multiple times in theaters. They're good fun, and they speak to the soul on a deep level. Optimus Prime is also one of the greatest orators in film history. Most, of course, don't feel that way. I think a solid majority enjoyed the first Transformers, but while the box office climbed to new heights, critical reception for the sequels was low. One issue was casting changes, such as dropping Megan Fox for Rosie Huntington-Whiteley, and then Shia LaBeouf exiting after the third one. Bay himself was ready to stop after Dark of the Moon, but the man was too successful for his own good, and turning down all that money was hard to do. In his words, quote, I just made too many of them. Steven Spielberg said, just stop at 3, and I said I'd stop. The studio begged me to do a 4th, and then that made $1 billion too. And then I said I'm going to stop here, and they begged me again. I should have stopped. They were fun to do, end quote. Then came 2017's Transformers The Last Night, my least favorite and certainly the weakest of the 5 that Bay directed. It begins with King Arthur, Merlin, and the Knights of the Round Table for some reason. Optimus gets mind controlled and turns on his friends. And similar to how Michael Caine did Jaws the Revenge for a Payday, Anthony Hopkins did the same here. Mark Wahlberg returned, but Nicola Peltz didn't. Similar to how Age of Extinction has a slick scene with Optimus riding Grimlock, this one's got a slick scene where Optimus beheads a bunch of robots, which you can see in the trailer. The scenes with Dragonstorm are pretty sweet as well, but all of the scenes don't combine to make a movie that's better than the sum of its parts. The movie had 3 people writing the screenplay, 4 working on the story, and none of them were involved in the previous movies. For comparison's sake, the next Transformers movie, Bumblebee, released a year later, had just 1 person, Christina Hodson, doing the story and the screenplay. The result was the most critically successful of the Transformers movies. For this one, there were just too many chefs in the kitchen and they produced a muddled mess. Critics certainly thought so. Peter Travers, writing for Rolling Stone, wrote, quote, "Transformers The Last Night is all kinds of awful. It's also the worst of the series to date, which is saying something," end quote. Brian Truitt, writing for USA Today, was accurate in writing, quote, "Even if you love alien robots punching each other while tossing out insipid one-liners, which I happen to do, it's a painfully long 2.5 hours where the biggest problem isn't a lack of plot, but way too many of them," end quote. And Bill DeBerry, writing one of my favorite reviews for any movie ever, said, quote, "In the opening scene of Transformers The Last Night, we are presented with the spectacle of King Arthur and his knights locked in an existential battle for the survival of human civilization, even though we're not really told who or what they're fighting for. No matter, because this, after all, is a Transformers movie, so we're soon faced with," unquote, after which it devolves into gibberish, much of which I comprehend and will leave as an exercise to the viewer to discern. The movie suffered a precipitous drop at the box office, making $605 million, compared to Age of Extinction's $1.1 billion before. People were tired of bad Transformers movies. Bumblebee looked like it could resuscitate the series, though the follow-up, Rise of the Beasts, fared poorly. All that said, Michael Bay is apparently working on a new Transformers movie. It's been 8 years since The Last Night. I hope he's able to get it done. Few do grand scale, which Transformers certainly deserves, better than Michael Bay. Paul Verhoeven's 1987 film, RoboCop, is a masterpiece and one of the defining films of the 1980s. The censor boards really didn't like it thanks to the violence, and several scenes were cut or shortened in order to secure an R rating. Nonetheless, it was a success not just commercially, but critically. This is a movie that has a lot to chew on, and critics had a hard time pigeonholing it. It's been hailed as a groundbreaking film with the excessive violence playing into its satire. It touched on important themes like the power of corporations, humanity, life and death, and would even earn awards recognition. Naturally, some wanted to continue it, and so we got a RoboCop 2, directed by Empire Strikes Back director Irvin Kershner. This one did not have the same reception as its predecessor. It was penned by comic book writer Frank Miller, who a few years prior had done the groundbreaking The Dark Knight Returns comic. It doubled down on the violence and caught a lot of flack for having a kid be a drug kingpin and a killer. Of it, Janet Maslin wrote, quote, "The aimlessness of RoboCop 2 runs so deep that after exploiting the inherent shock value of such an innocent-looking killer, the film tries to capitalize on his youth by also giving him a tearful deathbed scene," end quote. Still, the movie made some money and thus got a sequel, and that's when things went from bad to worse. RoboCop 3, while it still made money and might have been more profitable than its predecessor, was an unmitigated critical disaster and iced the franchise for a long time. Kershner was replaced by Fred Decker, and Peter Weller, who played Alex Murphy in the previous 2 movies, was replaced by Robert Burke, and in a misguided attempt to appeal to a wider audience, the movie aimed for a PG-13 rating and reduced the violence and satire that made the first so great. In losing the edge of the previous 2 movies, especially the first, RoboCop 3 lost itself. It lacked Verhoeven's subversive touch and aimed for a younger audience. There was a child hacker, robo-ninjas, and more cartoonish villains, though Rip Torn is always fun to see in almost any role that he's been in. The lacking bite was a point of contention for a lot of critics. Stephen Holding, writing for the New York Times, wrote, quote, "Where the director Paul Verhoeven infused the original RoboCop with an attitude of mock solemnity, RoboCop 3 has the energy and style of a cartoon free-for-all," end quote. And Kim Newman, writing for Empire, wrote, quote, "Unsurprisingly, this is the worst in the RoboCop trilogy, with the plot proving ridiculous, excelling itself particularly in the climax. For what was a promising debut, its reputation was quickly tarnished with the drivel such as this that followed," end quote. Others thought that it was actually better than RoboCop 2, though this isn't a sentiment that I've ever actually encountered in real life before, so I'm not sure if those critics are just a figment of my imagination. By this point, the franchise was diluted and there was nowhere to go. The franchise had lost its best director and then its own star. It was put on ice until it was rebooted in 2014. The reboot did a serviceable job at the box office and got better reviews than RoboCop 2 and RoboCop 3, but plans for a sequel were abandoned. Now, Amazon wants to try rebooting it again. We'll see how it goes. For now, Alex Murphy remains in stasis. Bad movies are a dime a dozen. Bad movie sequels are a bit rarer, only because most sequels aren't really so bad as they are disappointing. I think movies like the last 2 Indiana Jones movies, as well as the prequel and sequel trilogy, are more disappointing when compared against their predecessors, as opposed to being actively bad. It takes a real contender to be one of the worst sequels ever made, which carries the implication of being one of the worst movies ever made. Still, more than a few have achieved such notoriety, and even this just scratches the surface. There are a lot more.